let's talk about getting pieces of leather stuck together. This is a pretty important step because it allows you to essentially create one piece of leather, so when you go back through and you finish an edge, you burnish, it ends up looking like one continuous piece of leather, not two pieces or three pieces or however many that are stacked together. If we don't glue it up to the edge, even if you go through and you burnish and you do everything, over time it'll separate and it just won't look nice. It also creates a stronger edge, so you're not relying as much on the stitching as you were if that was the only thing holding it together. There are several different ways to go about it. There's different things you can use. So we're going to start here. We have some pull-up leather. So this is pretty waxy. It has waxes and dyes in suspension in the leather. This won't adhere very well on that surface. Now your flesh side usually is pretty easy to glue up. So the first thing I want to talk about is using a rougher to create a surface that glue can grab onto. So this little rougher is a pretty cool tool. You can rough up an edge a couple of ways. You can do this. You can use the side of a scratch awl if you wanted to. You just come in at an angle and you can kind of remove it. This takes a lot of time. You have potential to scratch up the leather. You can use the side of a blade. Same issue, you could cut into your leather. You could use a piece of sandpaper, but what I like to do is just use this little rougher. So I'm going to say, I want this sort of maybe a 5 mil inset, which is pretty typical for me. So I'll say about like that. I'll score it, and then I can come back with a straight edge. And then you have a guide for your rougher. You can just make a pass or two. Try to line this up. All we're doing is just taking off that top layer so the glue has something to hold on to. Need to be super pretty. Just kind of catching this edge. Ruler. Anyway, that's close enough. That'll do what we need it to do. So if we want to glue up, we got a couple options there. We can either use a rubber cement, like a barge is a pretty common rubber cement for leatherworking applications. I don't really like it. It kills some brain cells. It's pretty toxic, and if you're doing what I'm doing, where you're just heads down over your projects all the time, I don't really want to be breathing that. What I prefer is the EcoFlow leather weld. It works great. It's a little more watery than the rubber cement, obviously. So you have to be thoughtful about keeping these containers sealed, otherwise they'll dry out. So a glue pot doesn't work real well for this, where it would work really well with the rubber cement. I prefer this. I like having it in this little bottle versus just a container. That way I can lay it down and then come back and fill in as I need to versus scooping leather or glue out of a container all the time. You have a couple of options for applicators. These little plastic applicators are real cheap. I like these when I'm doing something small and I kind of just want to be precise, and I can put it down in a bottle first. If I'm doing a lot of gluing, I will typically use a foam brush. Now the foam brushes are going to use a lot more glue because you need to soak up first and then apply, where this, whatever glues down gets spread versus sucking up a bunch that you're wasting. That's one option. Now another option would be using double-sided seam tape. I use this a whole lot when I'm not concerned about there being a little bit of overlap. So if I got my 5 mil inset and I put this down here and my stitch line is right here running this way, I've got all this extra. So if this is a card pocket or something and I got to slide a card in, the card's going to get stuck. It's going to get all gummed up and it'll be gross. So I only use this double-sided tape when I don't have to worry about anything sliding in or out. Now, what's the time you don't want to glue up? I just want to cover that real quick. Whenever you're making a bag or something with a turned edge, you don't want to put, you're going to go face to face because you're going to end up rolling it out, and that stitch line is what's holding this so you can make that turn. I wouldn't glue that up. I wouldn't put tape there. What I use for that on a bag or whatever that needs that turned edge, I'll just use clips. Just cheap little fabric clips are going to work great. especially when you're on the flesh side, you don't have to worry about marking up the leather, where if you were on the finish side, that compression can leave a mark. It's not doing it on this, but some of the leather it'll leave a mark. If you're having that concern, taking a thin piece of leather, you know, maybe something that's only a couple of ounces, you can see the marks on this actually pretty well. I'll wrap that edge, that turned edge, and then put this on so I'm not marking my leather. That's another option. All right, so let's do a little bit of glue up. If I'm gonna go face to face like this, then this is where this is pretty useful. It's still gonna, it'll stack either way. If you gotta do it this way, for whatever reason, if you have something that you have to do inverted like that, just make sure you have a good surface on both sides. So let's get this glue on here. Now leather glue needs to be applied on both sides. It won't work if you only do it on one side. Take my little applicator. Now for the sake of this, I'm not going to be super pretty with it. If I were to be lazy and not take this top layer off first, all that's going to happen is glue's just not going to stick. And you need to give your glue time to set, typically about 5 minutes. If you don't let it set first, then you're going to wind up just having to hold it in place until it does set and it makes a mess. If you wait too long, then it just is not going to be tacky enough for it to work. So we'll come back here in about 5 minutes. This will be darker and we'll be ready to line it up and glue it together. I will say, if you want to speed this process up, you can use a heat gun, or even a hair dryer works really well. You just put it on the the hot setting and just kind of cruise back and forth. It'll dry out pretty quick. So we'll come back in a second. So it's been a few minutes here. You can see a lot of glue still. That's okay, because inside or beneath it, you can see where it's darkened up, much darker than when we started. That's what we want to see here. This just has been sitting a little bit longer, so you can see it's a lot darker underneath. A lot of that white is starting to fade. While we were waiting, what I did was roughed up this piece and put the double-sided tape down just to show you that. Now when I'm doing that, I'm real careful. You can see there's just this little bit of an edge where it's not quite all the way to the edge. The reason we do that is if we're going to burnish this, we want to make sure that none of that tape is coming to the outside, because you're not going to be able to really sand that off or burnish over it. It's just going to look pretty bad. Pretty easy process with this stuff, right? You just line it up, push it down. Now you can hold it for a minute. That's a bit much there for that. Typically, if this was edge to edge, if this was rotated 90 or 180 degrees, was over here, and we had an edge, this is fine, this press out, because we're just going to sand that off when it dries anyway. It's going to come off in the sanding process. So let's ignore that. It's not that big of a deal. This is just a test piece. You can see we're good now. This will hold. This will just harden and harden. It'll be a pretty strong bond. You can rip it off, but it'll be more than secure enough for what we got to do if we're going to go back through and stitch, and then when we burnish that edge, it'll be fine. Once this glue is tacky, where you set it is kind of where that thing's going to live, so be precise in where you're setting it. Grab my scratch awl here if I can get to it. Get this layer off, this top piece off. Okay. Flesh side, usually pretty good. Overlap it. And that's going to be a real strong bond too for what we need. So are kind of our main ways to do this. pretty straightforward, different applications for different things. I typically do glue whenever I need to do a pocket or something. If I'm just needing to hold down a turned edge, I'll typically use the tape.